In typical battle shonen fashion, a character like Mahito, who died somewhat towards the middle of the manga, would normally get power cliffed and be completely unable to compete by time the final arc comes around. So I wanted to see how Mahito would do if we were to throw him into the Culling games. He won't be fighting any of the players that were on the good guys side. He'll mainly just be going up against the villains, since that's where I think it's the most interesting. And to help me determine who would win these different versus battles, I brought my buddy Jaded on, so make sure you go subscribe to him. But before we get started, we have a word from today's sponsor. Today's video is brought to you by Poly AI, an advanced voice assistant that's truly changing the game. If you're like me, always on the lookout for ways to simplify your life, this app is a must-have. Poly AI isn't just any voice assistant. It understands your natural speech patterns and adapts to your style, making everyday tasks both easier and faster. Imagine being able to get real-time answers, manage your schedule, or even just chat, all through an assistant that gets you. Whether you're looking to boost productivity, stay organized, or just have some fun with AI, Poly AI has you covered. And here's the deal. By downloading Poly AI through the link in the description, after that, search my promo code 6FromTMPoly and you'll unlock exclusive features and perks that'll make your experience even better. So if you're ready to take your daily routine to the next level, click the link, download Poly AI, and see what it can do for you. Alright, JD, you can get us started with Reggie, since he's kind of the weakest guy here, the weakest link in Tokyo Colony #1.
So between everybody, like Six said, Reggie definitely is the weakest, and he's gonna be the easiest for Mahito to beat out of everybody in the Culling games. The only problem really with Reggie is the fact that everybody who he goes up against and everybody that he fights with is just really incredibly weak. Megumi had gone from in Shibuya tag teaming with Yuji and keeping up with Yuji to Yuji then completely surpassing that version of himself from before, landing Black Flashes, eating Sukuna fingers and whatnot. So really for Reggie, his technique is bad, his combat style is bad, his power is just overall weak, and he really doesn't have an answer for anything Mahito could really throw at him. He can't keep up with people in Mahito's tier. When Mahito does cast his domain, all he's going to be able to do is cast a hollow wicker basket, and eventually that thing is just going to destruct.
Yeah, and that's really all there is to say about Reggie. He's just not really worth a lengthy discussion, especially not when we have so many other more interesting people to go over, like the next person, that being Higuruma. Now, Higuruma probably has the best counter to Mahito in the entire Culling games, and that being his domain expansion. Even if you talk about a domain clash, it's more than likely not going to happen, since the times where they use their domains within combat between both of them in character, Higuruma uses domain at the beginning of a fight, like every single time. Mahito will use it if he starts to get pressed, but once Higuruma's domain is out, he's pretty much cooked anyway, because there's no violence allowed in Higuruma's domain. So it's not like he's going to be able to expand his domain in return, and it's not like Mahito's going to expect someone to just off rip expand a domain. It even caught Yuji off guard somewhat. What his domain actually does is pretty much the worst for Mahito to go up against. If Higuruma does deem you guilty, or if Judge Man, I guess, does deem you guilty, then you're pretty much cooked. And in Mahito's case, his one saving grace throughout most of the versus battle matchups you put him up against is sort of like Gojo with Infinity. You can't really hit him unless you're able to hit the soul. And there's later characters in the series who are able to hit the soul, specifically a lot of the Culling games players that we'll go over later. But with Higuruma, he sort of takes that out of the equation altogether, because let's be for real, Mahito is straight getting a guilty verdict. There's absolutely zero way around arguing around Mahito not being guilty in Judge Man's eyes, especially if Yuji was guilty. Same with Sukuna. This is going to be the second easiest sentencing that we've seen in this series so far. So Mahito is getting sentenced to death. He's getting his curse technique removed as well. So not only does he not have any of the shape manipulation and soul manipulation that we've seen him with before, he loses out on a good deal of his arsenal like that, because he can't manipulate any of his transfigured humans. Obviously, he's not doing a domain expansion, and he has to fight Higuruma with just cursed energy manipulation, which is more than likely going to be weakened just because of how Higuruma explains that when he takes these techniques away from sorcerers, since they've trained with their technique for so long, their cursed energy manipulation also starts to weaken as well. Yuji was a special case because Yuji's just real physically strong. The only thing he really was learning how to do as a sorcerer was amp himself up more with cursed energy. Mahito losing his technique, and we know Mahito, when he trains, he's normally training his technique, learning and trying to figure out more things about the soul. So I do think he would fall victim to this, like the other sorcerers that Higuruma fought that unfortunately we didn't get to see.
Just to add to what Six said, the idea of curse techniques being so ingrained to their combat style and just basically everything that they do, we know that muscle memory specifically overlays information about their jujutsu and whatnot, and that's really how far it goes to their own bodies remembering what it's like fighting with their own techniques. Not being able to use their techniques is going to change so much about their combat style, and especially for Mahito, who's constantly reshaping his soul and changing his soul to avoid attacks. So just like Six said, basically everything that Mahito does in the way that he fights, even on the way that he interacts with other sorcerers, even very early on in battle, it's all surrounding the idea of him constantly reshaping his soul, which is exactly what his curse technique does. So for Mahito to be without a curse technique, it's just an insane nerf to his overall fighting ability.
And this is all while he has to avoid getting touched by the executioner sword. If he gets touched one time by it, he's just going to die. Now, we do know that eventually the burnt out curse technique will return to the user, but the time for that to happen is really unknown. We never actually see it happen. And if you want to use Sukuna's curse tool as an example of how long confiscation takes things, Sukuna didn't get it back until the end of the manga. Like, he got it taken when Higuruma appeared, and he never got it back until he died. So it's not like Mahito's going to get his technique back, and with worse cursed energy manipulation, no curse technique, and having to just dodge the executioner sword, I don't see it working out for Mahito, and he's probably just gonna lose to Higuruma.
The only thing that you might be able to argue for Higuruma is the fact that his feats against Yuji aren't all too impressive. Yuji's definitely giving him a run for his money, and it's a Yuji without any cursed energy. And then obviously when you look at the Yuji that Mahito fought, this is a Yuji that's Black Flash amped, he's very angry, so naturally he's just gonna have more cursed energy sourcing through his system and whatnot, blah blah. You can make the argument that it might take Higuruma longer to get Mahito compared to it would be with Yuji, but combined with the nerfs and combined with everything, even if it does take a little bit longer, eventually he's going to end up giving Mahito the death penalty. So the thing is with Takaba, he's probably the most complicated sorcerer I want to say for Mahito, but that all comes down to how you think Takaba's curse technique works. When I say how you think Takaba's curse technique works, I mean how everybody would think Takaba's curse technique works. And in that way, we don't really know. We don't know specifically what jokes he's going to make to play out what scenes and scenarios that are going to be playing throughout this fight. We saw in his fight with Kenjaku that he had Kenjaku doing a whole bunch of nonsense, really. Like, I'm not even going to go into any of it specifically, but it's all just a whole bunch of nonsense. And that fight is really just going to come down to what happens in the moment. Now, the thing is with Takaba's curse technique is that, just like Yuta says, Takaba's curse technique can't really kill people, but eventually over time, they're obviously going to die because they're going to be stuck within the curse technique. And so again, that just comes down to what's going to happen while this curse technique is playing out. If Takaba thinks it's funny for Mahito to get hit by a truck that weighs 1,000 pounds, oh no, that's not going to kill Mahito. If Takaba thinks it's funny for Mahito to get hit by a meteor that weighs a gazillion pounds or something, then I guess, yeah, that would in theory kill Mahito, but is that going to happen? We just don't really know.
Yeah, and does Takaba think it funny that Mahito's soul gets twisted in proportions, and would his technique even do that? It's really up in the air. And like Jada said, it's really just up to how you think his technique is going to work. Whatever you can imagine Takaba doing, he could probably do that with his technique. So it's really, in all honesty, it might just be completely subjective as to if he beats Mahito or not. If you think he's just not funny enough to beat Mahito, he won't crack the right jokes, then he's not going to beat Mahito, and Mahito's going to beat him up. But one thing that is a fact is that Takaba does not kill people, or he can't kill people. So if he does beat Mahito, it's going to be through some like immobilization type win con. Now, moving on to Tokyo Colony number 2, there's just 2 people here that's worth going over. And really, is Charles really worth going over? Charles is decent with his curse technique, but Charles has no anti-domain tech. He obviously can't hit the soul, at least not from what we know, because he's not an incarnated player. And he has no domain in general. And Hikari's counter to Charles' technique kind of makes the technique seem fodder, right? Like he gets the ink put on him, and he's like, okay, well, if you can see where I'm gonna go, I'm just gonna move where you can't see me. And I think Mahito could definitely do that. If not move out of his line of sight himself, set up different transfigured humans beside him to hit him or something like that, or behind him, because we know he can control them at a distance. So, I mean, Charles is just gonna lose. That's simple. Now, the next person, Kashimo, is really worth talking about. And this is another person that's just interesting. So something we didn't really go over that we kind of need to is that all these Culling game players, all the reincarnated Culling game players anyway, are probably going to be able to hit the soul. They're probably going to be able to hit Mahito's soul. The way it's described, Yuji was able to learn how to hit the soul through being Sukuna's vessel and having two souls dwell within him. Kind of applies to all the Culling game players. Look at Hana and the Angel, the way Yorozu was manipulating Megami's sister's body, and the way Sukuna was doing the same thing to Megami. There's two souls within all these bodies, so naturally they should be able to perceive the contours of the soul as well and hit the soul. Now, this does not mean that all these people always hit the soul, but if Mahito gets to yapping off about his technique and how his technique works and how he manipulates the soul in order to get that disclosure amp, then these people should be able to look at and then start targeting and hitting his soul. Now, when it comes to Kashimo, I think in every way, Kashimo just outstats Mahito, and I think that's fair to say. So I don't know if Mahito is going to be willing to give up his technique and how it works to someone who's just outright faster than him, especially because we know Mahito can see the soul if he sees that Kashimo has two souls within him. All right, now it's possible Kashimo could figure it out. Kashimo's a smart fighter. He fought a lot of people, strongest of his era type guy. So what it really would probably come down to is how fast you think Kashimo can figure out he needs to hit Mahito's soul versus if Mahito by that time pulls out his domain expansion. I think it's probably more likely that Mahito would pull out his domain expansion before Kashimo figures out that he needs to hit Mahito's soul. The reason I think that is just because whenever Mahito is getting pressed, he normally pulls out his domain expansion, and he gets a lot of, I would say, downplay in this area because most of his fights are against people he either doesn't need his domain for, or against Yuji where he can't use it because then Sukuna's gonna, do what he did to him in the versus Mahito arc. So like when he was getting pressed against Mekamaru, he immediately just pulled out his domain and used it. Now, Kashimo does have anti-domain tech, but as we all know, with Hollow Wicker Basket, eventually, and Simple Domain, eventually they're just going to crumble within the domain. And the only reason someone like Sukuna is able to keep Hollow Wicker Basket up is because he has 4 arms. He can use 2 of his arms to maintain the hand signs and whatnot. If Kashimo tries to do something like that, he's gonna get cooked because he can't fight with his arms anymore because he's maintaining Hollow Wicker Basket.
Kashimo is a very smart fighter, and I don't think a lot of people really give him credit for that. He's constantly adjusting the way he fights against Akari, figuring out the best way to deal with his domain expansion and whatnot. Even at, sacrificing his own, basically life, honestly, jumping into the water and using everything he had to beat Akari. There's not really much he's not going to be willing to try in order to beat Mahito, especially if he's slowly figuring out his technique. The only real problem is going to be the fact that his anti-domain tech isn't really that good. That's the problem. Now, just like Six said, Mahito does activate his domain when he's pressed. That's just basically what it is. When Mahito's pushed into a corner, he's going to activate his domain. Now, can Kashimo beat him and subdue him before he can do that? I don't really know, because it's a lot harder to say that he would for a cursed spirit than he would for a human. Like we see with Dagon, for example, when Dagon has his arms ripped off by Naobito, when he's in a position that Naobito believes that, oh yeah, this guy can't cast his domain, he finds another way to do it. And then especially with somebody like Mahito, who can make like mouths in his he can make arms in his mouth and stuff like that, it's going to be really hard for Kashimo to put him in a position where he's not going to be able to cast his domain.
And with Mahito, there is something that happened in Shibuya that is sort of like maybe Mahito could do it again. I just want to mention it just so everyone knows about it. When Mahito uses his domain, the 0.2 second domain on Yuji and Todo, what he does is he combines curse technique activation and domain expansion basically into one. And Hikari was faster than that whenever he used his domain on Kashimo. And it said that the sure hit Kashimo before he could even think to start using Hollow Wicker Basket. Now, it does say Mahito was only able to do that because he was activated by Black Flash. That's the wording or whatever. I'm not sure if that means Mahito can only do it when activated through Black Flash, or that he figured out how to do it because he was activated through Black Flash. And the difference in wording there is important, because if he can do that again, then there's less of a chance for Kashimo to actually activate Hollow Wicker Basket and, successfully counter Mahito. And it just makes the battle go even further in Mahito's favor. But for the most part, Kashimo is much stronger than Mahito, and Mahito's only saving grace is the fact that Kashimo can't or doesn't know how, whatever you want to say, to hit his soul. So moving on from Tokyo Colony number 2 and just into Sakurajima, Mahito actually does really well here. There's no characters in this colony that Mahito can't beat. Curse Naoya and Daido similarly both lose. Daido can hit the soul, but he can't see cursed spirits, and he has no anti-domain tech whatsoever.
The most impressive person in this colony and throughout this entire arc is obviously Maki. Maki would be like our link to backscale everybody to Mahito, basically, right? And for everybody to be impressive, they would have to scale somewhat in reference to wherever Maki is. Curse Naoya does do that, but when he's sped up. And when Curse Naoya isn't sped up, Maki has no problem really fighting him, and his best feats on Maki are going to be when he's sped up. The problem is with Daido is that Daido doesn't have any feats on a sped up Naoya. And for Naoya to have the time to speed up, I think if Naoya does speed up, it would be a problem for Mahito. But again, just like Kashimo, the second he's pushed into that corner, Mahito's going to activate his domain. So when it comes to Daido, I mean, like Six said, he has no anti-domain tech. He does have Maki's sword, so he would be able to target where Mahito's the most vulnerable and everything. And, even though he can't see, he can see the soul. And he'd have no problem finding out where Mahito is and whatnot. But again, no anti-domain tech, no real feats to really link him back to Mahito. It's just a really bad matchup for Daido, in my opinion.
Naoya, without a doubt, faster than Mahito. Not arguing with anyone there. However, Naoya just got his domain. Falling Blossom Emotion, probably not going to work on a complicated sure hit like Idol Transfiguration. So his only domain tech would be, or anti-domain tech, sorry. So his only anti-domain tech would be his domain expansion. And Naoya just got his domain expansion. He doesn't even know that he can't sense Maki with it. He clearly basically just figured out how to use it. So saying it would be as refined as someone like Mahito's domain expansion is just not true. So he's probably going to lose the domain clash. And on top of this all, Naoya cannot hit the soul. Like, even if Naoya does win the domain clash against Mahito and he successfully lands his sure hit on Mahito, Naoya's sure hit is harmless. The sure hit effect, or what happens afterwards, is where all the harm comes, and it's just bodily harm. It's not soul damage or anything like that. So yes, Mahito will get affected by the sure hit, just like Kenjaku says, they bypass curse techniques or whatever. He'll get affected by the sure hit, and when he tries to move, he will be all discombobulated or whatever, and his cells will hurt, but it's not gonna kill him. So Naoya really just has absolutely no way to win. And that's why I'm saying, in Sakurajima, Mahito just kind of comes in here and clears out. It's the only colony where he will have absolutely no losses.
Even then, if you're saying that Naoya would win, it's honestly pretty generous to Naoya in my opinion, because if there's one thing about Mahito especially, it's that throughout his time fighting, he gets better at using his curse technique. And I'm not even making the argument that throughout the battle with Naoya, he would get better with his curse technique, but that he's been getting better, especially after getting his domain expansion. So for a guy, especially Mahito, who's constantly growing, constantly refining his technique, I don't really see a reason why his domain wouldn't be included in that. And then on top of, obviously, depending on the way that you interpret the Awakened by Black Flash, allowing for the activation of his domain in that specific way, he might honestly, he might just activate his domain much faster than Naoya. And he honestly, because both of them use their domains when they are pressed, right? For sure. But I feel like Mahito would use it in a less pressed situation, if that makes sense. Like Naoya would use it when he's like cut down and beaten on the ground, but Mahito would use it in the same situation that he was against the Mechamaru and against Yuji and Todo. He would definitely be the one to use it first, even if he's less pressed.
All right, and so we can just move on to Sendai Colony now. This is undoubtedly the colony where Mahito does the worst. He'll have more losses here than wins if he even gets any. So he'll probably beat Druve and Kuroshi, and I'm not gonna go too in depth on them. When me and Broken Ronin did Toji versus the Culling games, we went really in depth on those two for whatever reason. It's not like they have fans or anything like that or interesting scaling. But Druve gets one shot. He has absolutely no scaling, and Kuroshi only gets as far as he does on Yuta because Yuta doesn't want to reveal that he has reverse curse technique, and he's clearly holding back on him. He doesn't have Rika or anything like that. So it's not like either of those two are even really that impressive. So the only heavy hitters, I guess, in this colony all pretty much wipe the floor with Mahito. Now, unlike Naoya, but similar to Kashimo, these people can hit the soul and they have domain expansions, that being Ryu, Uro, and Yorozu. Yorozu is kind of an anomaly here because Mahito has absolutely no hope of even touching her. But Ryu and Uro both have domain expansions. They're both from long ago, so they can use their domains and they should be well refined. So unlike Naoya, they have domains that are going to be able to domain clash with Mahito, if not win a domain clash with Mahito. Now, the difference here is they're able to hit the soul just like Kashimo is, but they're actually gonna have more time to figure it out because there's no way for Mahito to actually just get rid of these guys the way that Mahito could do with Kashimo because he didn't have a domain. And for those reasons, I mean, Mahito really kind of stands no chance here. Mahito is definitely not keeping up with Yuta the way Ryu did, and he's not keeping up with Uro the way Yuta did. Uro as well can just simply fly. Like she can fly out of Mahito's range. And so it's not like she has to even engage him how he wants. And she can, you know, obviously bend space, attack him how she wants to. So in this situation, I don't really know what you would expect us to say Mahito even does. I mean, you can add if you want what you think Mahito would do, or you know, if you think he could counter them, whatever. I just don't really see it.
So for Mahito, there's not really much he can do. The scaling couldn't be more blatant in my opinion. Yuta just gets done literally killing Yuji, and then Yuji just got done basically killing Mahito, and then that Yuta with Rika goes on to fight every single one of them in Sendai Colony. So for me, Mahito is obviously outstatted the second he gets inside this colony. There's not much he can do. In a domain clash, again, these are all sorcerers from way long ago. They're much more used to clashing with domains, and arguably, debatably, they have more experience clashing domains than Mahito. Considering the fact that Mahito's never done it, but we've never seen them, they come from a time periods where domains are they're used much more frequently. So I mean, I would argue, but then again, that's not even really the point. They're faster, they're stronger. Each of them have very high output hitting attacks. Thin Icebreaker, Granite Blast, each of those attacks definitely carry enough power to definitely take down Mahito if they land. And if they land isn't even really an if, because both of these attacks have landed on Yuta, and Yuta would be way faster than that Mahito.
And that's pretty much the end of that. I mean, there's really no real way to argue for Mahito winning here. And the only reason Yorozu's even here is just because I found out she was also in Sendai Colony as well. so I wanted to include her in the video. But I mean, even like, I don't know why anyone would even be expecting us to put Mahito on the level of someone who can fight with 15 finger Sukuna. So I'm really just gonna leave it at that.